The Tale of the Farmer and the Badger. Long, long ago, there lived an old farmer and his wife, who made their home in the mountains, far, far from any town. Their only neighbor was a bad and malicious badger. This badger used to come out every night and run across the farmer's field to spoil the vegetables and the rice which the farmer spent his time carefully cultivating. The badger at last grew so ruthless in his mischievous work, and did so much harm everywhere on the farm, that even the good-natured farmer could no longer stand it, and he determined to put a stop to it. So he lay in wait, day after day, and night after night, with a big club, hoping to catch the badger, but it was all in vain. Then he laid traps for the wicked animal, and the farmer's trouble and patience was indeed rewarded, for one fine day, on going his rounds, he found the badger caught in a hole he had dug for that purpose. The farmer was delighted at having caught his enemy, and carried him home securely, bound with a rope. When he reached the house, the farmer said to his wife, "I have at last caught this horrible badger. You must keep an eye on him while I am out at work, and not let him escape, because I am going to make him into a soup this very evening." Saying this, he hung the badger up to the rafters of his storehouse, and went out to his work in the fields. Well, the badger, it was in great distress, as you could imagine, for he did not at all appreciate the idea of being made into a soup, and he thought and thought for a long time, trying to hit upon some plan in which he might escape. It was hard to think clearly, of course, in his uncomfortable position, for he had been hung upside down. Very near to him, at the entrance to the storehouse, looking out towards the green fields and trees and the pleasant sunshine, stood the farmer's old wife, pounding barley. She looked old and tired. Her face was seamed with many wrinkles, and was brown as leather, and every now and then she stopped to wipe the sweat which rolled down her face. "Dear lady," said the wily badger, "you must be very weary doing such heavy work in your old age. Won't you let me do that for you? My arms are very strong, you see, and I could relieve you at least for a little while." The old woman looked at the badger, and replied, "Well, thank you for your kindness, but, well, I cannot let you do this work for me, because, well, I'm not allowed to untie you, for you might escape if I did. Oh, yes, and then my husband would be very angry indeed if he came home and found you gone, all the trouble that you've been to him." Now, the badger is, as you should know, one of the most cunning of animals, and he said again in a very sad and gentle voice, "Oh, you are very unkind. You might untie me. I promise I will not try to escape. If you are afraid of your husband, I will let you bind me again before his return, when I finished pounding the barley for you. I am so tired and sore, being tied up like this for so long. If only you would let me down just for a few minutes, oh, I would be so thankful." Now the old woman had a very good and simple nature about her, and could not think badly of anyone, even the badger. Much less did she think that the badger was only deceiving her in order to get away. Well, she felt sorry, too, for the animal, as she turned to look at him in that sorry state. He looked in such a sad plight, hanging downwards from the ceiling by his little legs, which were all tied together so tightly that the rope and the knots were even cutting into his skin. And so, in the kindness of her kind heart, and believing the creature's promise that he would indeed not run away, she untied the cord, and she let him down. The old woman then gave him the wooden pestle, and told him to do the work for a short time, while she could get a little bit of rest. He took the pestle, but instead of doing the work as he was told, the badger at once sprang upon the old woman, and knocked her down with the heavy piece of wood. He then killed her, and cut her up, and made soup of her, and waited for the return of the old farmer. The old man worked hard in his fields all day, and as he worked, he thought with pleasure that no more now would his labor be spoiled by this troublesome and destructive badger. Towards sunset, he left his work and returned to go home, and he was indeed very tired, but the thought of a nice supper of hot badger soup awaiting his return was certainly more than enough to give him some cheer. The thought that the badger might get free and take revenge on the poor old woman, well, that was something that simply never came across his mind. Meanwhile, the badger had assumed the old woman's form, and as soon as he saw the old farmer approaching, came out to greet him on the veranda of the little house. "So, husband, you have come back at last. I have made the badger soup, and have been waiting for you, oh, such a long time." The old farmer quickly took off his straw sandals, and sat down before his tiny dinner tray. The innocent man never even dreamed that it was not his wife but the badger who was waiting upon him, and asked at once for a nice bowl of soup. And then the badger suddenly transformed himself back into his natural form, and cried out, "You wife-eating old man, look out for the bones in the kitchen." Laughing loudly and derisively, he escaped out of the house and ran away to his den in the hills. The old man was left behind, alone. He could hardly believe what he had seen, no less what he had heard. And when he understood the whole truth, he was so scared and horrified that he fainted right away. After a while, he came round, and when he did, he burst into tears. He cried loudly and bitterly. He rocked himself to and fro in his hopeless grief. It seemed too terrible to be real, that his faithful old wife had been killed and cooked by the badger while he was working quietly in the fields, knowing nothing of what was going on at home, and congratulating himself on having once and for all got rid of the wicked animal who had so often spoiled his fields. And oh, the horrible thought! He had very nearly drunk the soup which the vile creature had made of his poor old wife. "Oh, my dear! Oh, my dear wife!" he cried aloud. Now, not far away, there lived in the mountain a kind, good-natured old rabbit, the opposite of the badger, for sure. And this old rabbit had heard the old man crying and sobbing, and at once set out to see what was the matter with him. and if there was anything he could do to help his neighbor. The old man told him all that had happened. When the rabbit heard the story, he was so angry at the wicked and deceitful badger, and told the old man to leave everything to him. He would be the one to avenge his poor wife's death. The farmer was at last comforted, and wiping away his tears, thanked the rabbit for his goodness in coming to him in such distress. The rabbit, seeing the farmer was growing calmer finally, went back to his home to lay his plans for the punishment of the badger. The next day, the weather was fine, and the rabbit went out to find the vile badger. He was not to be seen in the woods, nor on the hillsides, or in the fields anywhere. So the rabbit went to his den, and he found the badger hiding in there, for the animal had been far too afraid to show himself ever since he escaped from the farmer's house, for fear of the old man's wrath. The rabbit called out, "Badger, why are you not out on such a beautiful day? Can't you see the sun shining? Come out with me, and we will go out and cut grass on the hills together." The badger, never doubting that the rabbit was his friend, willingly consented to go with him, only too glad to get away from the neighborhood of the farmer and the fear of meeting him. The rabbit led the way miles away from their homes, out on the hills where the grass grew tall and thick and sweet. They both set to work to cut down as much as they could carry home, to store it up for their winter's food. When they had each cut down all they wanted, they tied it in bundles, and then started homeward, each carrying his bundle of grass on his back. But this time, the rabbit made the badger go ahead first. When they had gone a little way, the rabbit took out a flint and steel, and, striking it over the badger's back as he stepped along in front, set his bundle of grass on fire. The badger heard the flint striking and asked, "What is that noise? Crack, crack." "Oh, that's nothing," replied the rabbit. "I only said crack, crack because this mountain is actually called Crackling Mountain." The fire soon spread in the bundle of dry grass on the badger's back. The badger, hearing the crackle of the burning grass, asked, "What is that?" The rabbit answered, "Oh, well, you see, badger, we have now come to the burning mountain." By this time, the bundle was nearly burned out, and all the hair had been burned off the badger's back. He now knew what had happened by the smell of the smoke and the burning of the grass. Screaming with pain, the badger ran as fast as he could to his hole. The rabbit followed and found him lying on his bed, groaning in pain. "Oh, what an unlucky fellow you are," said the rabbit. "I can't imagine how all this happened. So mysterious. You just wait here. I will bring you some medicine, which will certainly heal your back quite quickly." The rabbit went away, glad and smiling to think that the punishment upon the badger had already begun. He hoped that the badger would succumb to the wounds of his burns, for he felt that nothing could be too bad for the animal who was guilty of dispatching the poor, helpless old woman who had trusted him so much. He went home, and he made an ointment. Made it by mixing some sauce and red pepper together. And he carried this to the badger. But before putting it on, he told him that it would cause him great pain, but he must bear it patiently, because it was a very wonderful medicine for burns and scalds and such wounds. While the badger trusted him, and thanked him, and begged him to apply it at once. But no language of mine can describe the agony of the badger as soon as the red pepper had been pasted all over his sore back. He rolled over, and he howled louder than he had ever howled before. The rabbit, looking on, felt that the farmer's wife was perhaps beginning to be avenged. The badger was in bed for about a month, but at last, in spite of the red pepper application, his burns healed, and he got well. When the rabbit saw that the badger was getting well, he thought of another plan by which he could compass the creature's death. So he went one day to pay the badger a visit, and to congratulate him on his swift recovery. During the conversation, the rabbit mentioned that he was going fishing, and described how pleasant fishing was when the weather was fine and the sea was smooth. The badger listened with pleasure to the rabbit's account of the way he passed his time now, and forgot all his pains and his month's illness, and thought what fun it would be if he could go fishing too. And so he asked the rabbit if he would take him the next time he went out to fish. This was just what the rabbit wanted, so he of course agreed. The day came when the rabbit had arranged to take the badger fishing. He kept the wooden boat himself, and gave the badger the clay boat. The badger, who knew nothing of boats at all, was delighted with his new boat, and thought how kind it was for the rabbit to give it to him. Thus they both got into their boats and set out. After going some distance from the shore, the rabbit proposed that they should try their boats to see which one could go the quickest. The badger fell in with the proposal, and they both set to work to row as fast as they could for some time. In the middle of the race, the badger found his boat going to pieces, for the water now began to soften the clay. He cried out in great fear to the rabbit to help him, but the rabbit answered that he was avenging the old woman's murder, and that this had been his intention all along, and that he was happy to think that the badger had at last met his just deserts for his evil crimes, and was to drown with no one coming to help him. And then he raised his oar and struck the badger with all his strength, till he fell with the sinking clay boat, and was never seen again. Thus, at last, he kept his promise to the old farmer. The rabbit now turned and rowed shorewards, and having landed and pulled his boat upon the shore, hurried back to tell the old farmer everything, and how the badger, his enemy, had finally been killed. The old farmer thanked him, with tears in his eyes. He said that till now he could never sleep at night, or be at peace in the daytime, thinking of how his wife's death was unavenged. But from this time he would be able to sleep and eat as of old. He begged the rabbit to stay with him and share his home, and so from this day the rabbit went to stay with the old farmer, and they both lived together as best friends to the end of their days. The Adventures of Kintaro, the Golden Boy. Long, long ago, there lived in Kyoto a brave soldier. His name was Kintoki. he fell in love with a beautiful girl and eventually married her. Not long after this, through the malice of some of his friends, he fell into disgrace at court and was dismissed. This misfortune so preyed upon his mind that he did not long survive his dismissal, and he died, leaving behind him his beautiful young wife to face the world alone. Fearing her husband's enemies, she fled to the Ashigara Mountains as soon as her husband had died, and there in the lonely forests, where no one ever came except woodcutters, a little boy was born to her. She called him Kintaro, or the Golden Boy. Now, the remarkable thing about this child was his great strength, and as he grew older, he only grew stronger and stronger, so that by the time he was 8 years of age, he was able to cut down trees as quickly as the woodcutters. Then his mother gave him a large axe, and he used to go out into the forest to help the woodcutters, who called him the Wonder Child, and they called his mother the old nurse of the mountains, for they did not know her high rank. Another favorite pastime of Kintaro's was to smash up the rocks and stones, so you can imagine how strong he truly was. But quite unlike other boys, Kintaro grew up all alone in the mountain wilds. As he had no companions, he made friends with all the little animals and learned to understand them and speak their strange languages. By degrees they all grew quite tame, and looked upon Kintaro as their master, and he used them as his servants and messengers. But his special retainers were the bear, the deer, the monkey, and the hare. The bear often brought her cubs for Kintaro to play with, and when she came to take them home, Kintaro would get on their back and have a ride to her cave. He was very fond of the deer, too, and he would often put his arms round the creature's neck to show that its long horns did not frighten him. Great was the fun that they all had together in those peaceful days. Now one day, as usual, Kintaro went up to the mountains, followed by the bear, the deer, the monkey, and the hare. After walking for some time up hill and down dale over rough roads, they suddenly came out upon a wide and grassy plain, covered with pretty and wild flowers. Here, indeed, was a nice place where they could all have a good play together. The deer rubbed his horns against a tree for pleasure. The monkey scratched his back. The hare smoothed his long ears, and the bear gave a grunt of deep satisfaction. Kintaro said, "Here is a place for good games. What do you say to a wrestling match?" The bear, being the biggest and the oldest, answered for the others. "Well, that will be great fun," she said. "I am the strongest animal, so I will make the platform for the wrestlers." And she set to work with a will to dig up the earth and to pat it into shape. "All right," said Kintaro. "I will look on while you all wrestle with each other. I shall give a prize to the one who wins in each round." "Oh, what great fun," said the bear. "Well, we shall all try and get the prize then." The deer, the monkey, and the hare set to work to help the bear raise the platform on which they were all to wrestle. When this was finished, Kintaro cried out, "Now, begin! The monkey and the hare shall open the sports, and the deer shall be the umpire. Now, Mr. Deer, you are to be the umpire." "He he he," answered the deer. "I will be the umpire. Great. Now, Mr. Monkey and Mr. Hare, if you are both ready, please walk out and take your places on the platform." Then the monkey and the hare both hopped out, quickly and nimbly, to the wrestling platform. The deer, as he was the umpire, stood between the two and called out, "Red back, red back!" This to the monkey, who has a red back in Japan, of course. "Are you ready?" And then he turned to the hare. Long ears, are you ready?" Both the little wrestlers faced each other while the deer raised a leaf on high as signal. When he dropped the leaf, the monkey and the hare rushed upon each other, crying, "Yoshaw, yoshaw, let's go!" While the monkey and the hare wrestled, the deer called encouragingly or shouted warnings to each of them, as the hare or the monkey pushed each other near the edge of the platform and were in danger of falling over. Red back, stand your ground," called out the deer. Long ears, be strong, don't let the monkey beat you," grunted the bear. So the monkey and the hare, encouraged by their friends, tried their very hardest to beat each other. The hare at last gained on the monkey, and the monkey seemed to trip up, and the hare, giving him a good push, sent him flying off the platform with a bound. Oh, the poor monkey sat up rubbing his back, and his face was very long as he screamed angrily, "Oh, how my back hurts! My back hurts me!" Seeing the monkey in this plight on the ground, the deer, holding his leaf on high, said, "The round is finished. The hare has won." Kintaro then opened his luncheon box and took out a rice dumpling, giving it to the hare, saying, "Here is your prize. You have earned it, and earned it well." Now the monkey got up, and looking very cross, and as they say in Japan, his stomach stood up, for he felt as he had not been fairly beaten. So he said to Kintaro and the others who were standing by, "I have been not fairly done by. My foot slipped and I tumbled. Please give me another chance and let the hare wrestle with me for another round." And then Kintaro consenting, the hare and the monkey began to wrestle again. Now, as everyone knows, the monkey is by its nature a cunning animal, and he made up his mind to get the best of the hare this time, if it were possible. To do this, he thought that the best and surest way would be to get hold of the hare's long ears. This he soon managed to do. The hare was quite thrown off his guard by the pain of having his long ear pulled so hard, and the monkey, seizing his opportunity at last, caught hold of one of the hare's legs and sent him sprawling in the middle of the days. The monkey was now the victor, and received a rice dumpling from Kintaro, which pleased him so much that he quite forgot about his sore back. The deer now came up and asked if the hare felt ready for another round, and if so, whether he would try a round with him. And the hare consenting, they both stood up to wrestle. The bear came forward as an umpire. The deer with long horns and the hare with long ears. It must have been an amusing sight to see those who watched this strange match. Suddenly, The deer went down on one of his knees, and the bear with the leaf on high declared him beaten. In this way, sometimes the one, sometimes the other, conquering, the little party amused themselves until they were quite tired. At last, Kintaro got up and said, "This is enough for today. What a nice place we have found for the wrestling. Let us come again tomorrow. Now we will all go home. Come along." So saying, Kintaro led the way, while the other animals followed closely behind him. After walking some little distance, they came out on the banks of a river flowing through a valley. Kintaro and his 4 furry friends stood and looked about for some means of crossing. Bridge there was none. The river rushed don 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 on its way. All the animals looked serious, wondering how they could cross the stream and get home that evening. Kintaro, however, said, "Wait a moment. I'll make a good bridge for you all in just a few minutes." The bear, the deer, the monkey, and the hare looked at him to see exactly how he was going to accomplish this. Kintaro went from one tree to another that grew along the river bank. At last, he stopped in front of a very large tree that was growing at the water's edge. He took hold of the trunk, pulled it with all his might, once, twice, thrice. At the third pull, so great was Kintaro's strength that the roots gave away, and crash, crash, over fell the tree, forming an excellent bridge across the stream. "There," said Kintaro. "What do you all think of my bridge? It's quite safe. So come on, follow me." And he stepped across first. The 4 animals followed. Never had they seen anyone so strong before, and they all exclaimed, "How strong he is! How strong Kintaro is!" While all this was going on by the river, a woodcutter, who happened to be standing on a rock overlooking the stream, had seen all that had passed beneath him. He watched with great surprise at Kintaro and his animal companions. He rubbed his eyes to be sure that he was not dreaming when he saw this boy pull over a tree by the roots and throw it across the stream to form a bridge. The woodcutter, for such he seemed to be by his dress, marveled at all he saw and said to himself, "This is no ordinary child. Whose son can he be? I will find it out before the day is done, that's for sure." He hastened after the strange party and crossed the bridge behind them. Kintaro knew nothing of all this, and little guessed that he was being followed. On reaching the other side of the river, he and the animals separated, they to their lairs in the woods, and he to his mother, who was waiting for him. As soon as he entered the cottage, which stood like a matchbox in the heart of the pine woods, he went to greet his mother, saying, "Oka-san, mother, here I am." "Oh, Kintaro," said to his mother with a bright smile, glad to see her boy home safe after the long day. "How late you are today! I feared something had happened to you. Where have you been all this time, Kintaro?" "I took my 4 friends, the bear, the deer, the monkey, and the hare, far up into the hills, and there I made them try a wrestling match to see who was the strongest. And we all enjoyed the sport, mother. Oh, we did. In fact, we're going to the same place tomorrow to have another match." His mother took it in good humor. "Oh, really? Well, now tell me, who is the strongest of them all?" asked his mother, pretending not to know. Kintaro replied to her. "Oh, mother," he said, "don't you know that I am the strongest? There was no need for me to wrestle any of them." "Well, but next to you, then, who is the strongest?" Kintaro answered quickly. "Of course the bear, mother. He comes next to me in strength." "And after the bear?" asked his mother again. "Next to the bear, well, it's not actually easy to say which is the strongest. For the deer, the monkey, and the hare all seem to be as strong as each other." Suddenly, Kintaro and his mother were startled by a voice from outside. "Listen to me, little boy. Next time you go, take this old man with you to the wrestling match. He would like to join the sport too." It was the woodcutter who had followed Kintaro from the river. He slipped off his clogs and entered the cottage. Yamauba and her son were both taken by surprise. They looked at the intruder with wonder and saw that he was someone that they had never seen before. "Who are you?" they asked. Then the woodcutter laughed and said, "It does not matter who I am yet, but let's see who has the strongest arm, this boy or me." Then Kintaro, who had lived in the forest all his life, answered the old man without any ceremony, saying, "We will have a try if you wish it, but you must not be angry whoever is beaten." Then Kintaro and the woodcutter both put out their right arms and grasped each other's hands. For a long time Kintaro and the old man wrestled each other in this way, each trying to bend the other's arm. But the old man was very strong indeed, and the strange pair were evenly matched. At last the old man desisted, declaring it a drawn game. "Oh, indeed, a very strong child. There are few men who could boast of strength of my right arm," said the woodcutter. "I saw you first on the banks of the river a few hours ago, you see, when you pulled up that large tree to make a bridge across the torrent. Hardly able to believe what I saw, I followed you home. Your strength of arm, which I have just tried, well, that proves enough what I saw this afternoon. When you're fully grown, you will surely be the strongest man in all of Japan. It's a pity you are hidden away in these wild mountains." Then he turned to Kintaro's mother. "And you, mother, have you no thought of taking your child to the capital and teaching him to carry a sword as befits a samurai?" "You are very kind to take so much interest in my son," replied the mother. "But he is, as you see, wild and uneducated, and I fear it would be very difficult to do as you say. Because of his great strength as an infant, I hid him away in this unknown part of the country, for he hurt everyone that ever came near him. I've often wished that I could, one day, see my boy a samurai, wearing 2 swords. But as we have no influential friend to introduce us at the capital, well, I fear that my hope will simply never come true." "You need not trouble yourself about that. To tell you the truth, I am no woodcutter. I am one of the great generals of Japan, and my name is Sadamitsu, and I am a vassal of the powerful Lord Minamoto no Raiko. He ordered me to go around the country and look for boys who give promise of remarkable strength, so that they may be trained as soldiers for his army. I thought that I could best do this by assuming the disguise of a woodcutter, you see. By good fortune, I have thus unexpectedly come across your son, Now, if you really wish him to become a samurai, I will take him, and I will present him to Lord Raiko as a candidate for his service. What do you say to this?" As the general gradually unfolded his plan, the mother's heart was filled with a great joy. She saw that here was a wonderful chance of the one wish of her life being fulfilled, that of seeing Kintaro a noble samurai before she went to the grave. Bowing her head to the ground, she replied, "I will then entrust my son to you, if you really mean what you say." Kintaro had all this time been sitting by his mother's side listening to what they said. When his mother had finished speaking, he exclaimed, "Oh, joy! What a great joy! I am going to go with the general, and one day I will be a samurai." And thus, like this, Kintaro's fate was settled, and the general decided to start for the capital at once, taking Kintaro with him. It need hardly be said that Yamauba was sad at parting with her boy, for he was all that she had left. But she hid her grief with a strong face, as they say in Japan. She knew that it was for her boy's own good, that he should leave her now, and she must not discourage him just as he was setting out. Kintaro promised never to forget her, and said that as soon as he was a samurai wearing 2 swords, he would build her a home and take care of her in her old age. All the animals, those he had tamed to serve him, the bear, the deer, the monkey, and the hare, as soon as they found out he was going away, came to ask if they might attend him as usual. When they learned he was going away for good, they followed him to the foot of the mountain to see him off. "Kintaro," said his mother, "mind yourself and be a good boy." "Mr. Kintaro," said the faithful animals, "we wish you good health on your travels." Then they all climbed to a tree to see the last of him, and from that height they watched him as his shadow gradually grew smaller and smaller, till he was lost to sight. The General Sadamitsu went on his way rejoicing at having so unexpectedly found such a progeny as Kintaro. Having arrived at their destination, the General took Kintaro at once to his lord, Minamoto no Raiko, and told him all about Kintaro and how he had found the child. Lord Raiko was, of course, delighted with the story, and having commanded Kintaro to be brought to him, made him one of his vassals at once. Lord Raiko's army, you see, was famous for its band called the 4 Braves. These warriors were chosen by himself from amongst the bravest and strongest of his soldiers, and the small and well-picked band was distinguished throughout the whole of Japan for the dauntless courage of its men. When Kintaro grew up to be a man, his master made him the chief of the 4 Braves, and he was by far the strongest of them all. Soon after this event, news was brought to the city that a cannibal monster had taken up his abode not far away, and that people were stricken with fear. Lord Raiko ordered Kintaro to the rescue. He immediately started off, delighted at the prospect of trying his sword, and, surprising the monster in its den, made short work of cutting off its giant head, which he carried all the way back in triumph to his master. And thus, that was how Kintaro rose to be the greatest hero of his time of the country, and great was the power and honor and wealth that came to him. He now kept his promise and built a comfortable home for his old mother, who lived happily with him in the capital to the end of her days. Is this not the story of a great hero? The Story of Princess Hase. Many, many years ago, there lived in Nara, the ancient capital of Japan, a wise state minister by the name of Prince Toyonari Fujiwara. His wife was a noble, good and beautiful woman called Princess Murasaki, or Violet. They had been married by their respective families according to Japanese custom when very young, and had lived together happily ever since. But they had, however, one cause for great sorrow, for as the years went by, no child was born to them. This made them very unhappy, for they both longed to see a child of their own who would grow up to gladden their old age, carry on the family name, and keep the ancestral rights when they were gone. The prince and his lovely wife, after long consultation and much thought, determined to make a pilgrimage to the temple of Hase no Kanon, the goddess of mercy at Hase, for they believed, according to the beautiful tradition of their religion, that the Mother of Mercy, Kanon, comes to answer the prayers of mortals in the form that they need the most. Surely, after all these years of prayer, she would come to them in the form of a beloved child in answer to their special pilgrimage, for that was the greatest need of their two lives. Everything else they had this life could give them, but it was all as nothing, because the cry of their hearts was so unsatisfied. So, Prince Toyonari and his wife went to the temple of Kanon at Hase, and stayed there for a long time, both daily offering incense and praying to Kanon, the Heavenly Mother, to grant them the desire of their whole lives, and their prayer was finally answered. A daughter was born at last to the Princess Murasaki, and great was the joy of her heart. On presenting the child to her husband, they both decided to call her Hase Hime, or the Princess of Hase, because she was the gift of the Kanon at that place. They both reared her with great care and tenderness, and the child grew in strength and beauty. When the child was 5 years old, her mother fell dangerously ill, and all the doctors and medicines could not save her. A little before she breathed her last, she called her daughter to her, and gently stroking her head, said these words, "Hase Hime, do you know that your mother cannot live any longer? Though I die, you have to grow up a good girl. Do your best not to give trouble to your nurse or any other of the family. Perhaps your father will marry again, and someone will fill my place as your mother. If so, do not grieve for me, but look upon your father's second wife as your true mother, and be obedient and filial to both her and your father. Remember, when you are grown up, to be submissive to those who are your superiors, and to be kind to all those who are beneath you. Don't forget this. I die with the hope that you will grow up to be a model woman." Hase Hime listened in an attitude of respect while her mother spoke, and promised to do all that she was told. There is in fact a proverb that says, As the soul is at 3, so it is at 100. And so Hase Hime grew up as her mother had wished, a good and obedient princess, though she was now too young to understand how great the loss of her mother really was. Not long after the death of his first wife, Prince Toyonari married again, a lady of noble birth named Princess Terute. Very different in character, however, to the good and wise Princess Murasaki. No, this new wife had a cruel and black heart. She did not love her stepdaughter at all, and was very often unkind to the little girl, saying to herself, "This is not my child." But Hase Hime bore every unkindness with patience, and even waited upon her stepmother kindly, and obeyed her in every way, and to that never gave her any trouble, just as she had been told by her own good mother, to the point that the Lady Terute had no cause for complaint against her. The little princess was diligent, and her favorite studies were music and poetry. She would spend several hours practicing each day, and her father had the most proficient of masters he could find to teach her the koto, a Japanese harp instrument, the art of writing letters and verse. And when she was 12 years of age, she could play so beautifully that she and her stepmother were summoned to the palace to perform before the emperor himself. It was the festival of the cherry flowers, and there were great festivities at court. The emperor threw himself into the enjoyment of the season, and commanded that Princess Hase should perform before him on the koto, and that her mother, Princess Terute, shall accompany her on the flute. The emperor sat on a raised pedestal, before which was hung a curtain of finely sliced bamboo and purple tassels, so that his majesty might see all and not be seen, for no ordinary subject was allowed to look upon his sacred face. Hase Hime was a skilled musician, though so young, and often astonished her masters by her wonderful memory and talent. On this momentous occasion she played well, but Princess Terute, her stepmother, who was a lazy woman, and never took the trouble to practice daily, broke down in her accompaniment, and had to request one of the court ladies to take her place. This was, of course, a great disgrace, and she was furiously jealous to think that she had failed where her stepdaughter had so succeeded. And to make matters worse, the emperor sent many beautiful gifts to the little princess to reward her for playing so well at the palace, while the stepmother received nothing. There was also now another reason why Princess Terute hated her stepdaughter, for she had the good fortune to have a son brought to her, and in her innermost heart she kept saying, "If only Hase Hime were not here, my son would have all the love of his father." And never having learned to control herself, she allowed this wicked thought to grow into an awful desire of taking her stepdaughter's life. And so one day she ordered some poison and poisoned some sweet wine. The poisoned wine she put into a bottle. Into another similar bottle she poured some good wine. It was the occasion of the boys' festival on the 5th of May, and Hase Hime, was playing with her little brother at the time. All of his toys of warriors and heroes were spread out, and she was telling him wonderful stories about each of them. They were both enjoying themselves and laughing merrily with their attendants, when his mother entered with the 2 bottles of wine and some delicious cakes. "You are both so good and happy," said the wicked Princess Terute, "that I have brought you some sweet wine as a reward, and here are some nice cakes for my good children." And then she filled the cups from the 2 different bottles. Hase Hime, never dreaming of the dreadful part her stepmother was acting, took one of the cups of wine and gave it to her little stepbrother, the other that had been poured out for him. The wicked woman had carefully marked out the poison bottle, but on coming into the room she had grown nervous, and pouring out the wine hurriedly, had unconsciously given the poisoned cup to her own son. All this time she was anxiously watching the little princess, but to her amazement, no change whatsoever took place on the young girl's face. But suddenly the little boy screamed and threw himself on the floor, doubled up with pain. His mother flew to him, taking the precaution to upset the 2 tiny jars of wine which she had brought into the room, and lifted him up. The attendants rushed for the doctor, but nothing could save the child. He died within an hour in his mother's arms. Doctors did not know much in those ancient times, you see, and it was thought that the wine had simply disagreed with the boy, causing an allergic convulsion of which he died from. Thus was the wicked woman punished into losing her own child when she had tried to do away with her stepdaughter. But instead of blaming herself, she began to hate Hase Hime more than ever in the bitterness and wretchedness of her own heart, and she eagerly watched for an opportunity to do her harm, which was, however, long in coming. When Hase Hime was 13 years of age, she had already become mentioned as a poetess of some merit. This was an accomplishment very much cultivated by the women of old Japan, and one certainly held in high esteem. It was the rainy season at Nara, and floods were reported every day as doing damage in the neighborhood. The river Tatsuya, which flowed through the imperial palace grounds, was swollen to the top of its banks, and the roaring of the torrents of water rushed along a narrow bed so disturbed the emperor's rest day and night that a serious nervous disorder was the result. An imperial edict was sent forth to all the Buddhist temples, commanding the priests to offer up continuous prayers to heaven and stop the noise of the flood, but it was to no avail. And then it was whispered in court circles that the Princess Hase, the daughter of Prince Toyonari Fujiwara, second minister at court, was the most gifted poetess of the day, though still so young, and her masters confirmed the report. Long ago, a beautiful and gifted maiden poetess had moved heaven by praying in beautiful verse, had brought down rain upon a land famished with drought, so said the ancient biographers of the poetess Ono no Komachi. If the Princess Hase were to write a poem and offer it in prayer, might it not stop the noise of the rushing river and remove the cause of the imperial illness? What the court said at last reached the ears of the emperor himself, and he sent an order to the minister Prince Toyonari to this effect. Great indeed was Hasehime's fear and astonishment when her father sent for her and told her what was required. Heavy indeed was the duty that was laid on her young shoulders, that of saving the emperor's life by the merit of her poem. At last, the day came when her work was finished. It was written on a leaflet of paper, heavily flecked with gold dust. With her father and attendants and some of the court officials, she proceeded to the bank of the roaring torrent and raised up her heart to heaven. She read the poem she had composed, aloud, lifting it heavenwards in her 2 hands. Strange indeed it seemed to all those standing around that the waters ceased their roaring, and the river was quiet in direct answer to her prayer. After this the emperor soon recovered his health. His Majesty was of course highly pleased, and sent for her to the palace, rewarding her with the rank of Chinjo, that of a lieutenant general, to distinguish her. And from that time she was called Chinjo Hime, or the Lieutenant General Princess, and thus she was respected and loved by all. Well, almost all. There was only one person in the land who was not pleased at Hasehime's success. It was, of course, her stepmother, forever brooding over the death of her own child, whom she had killed when trying to poison her stepdaughter. She had the mortification of seeing her rise to power and honor, marked by imperial favor and the admiration of the whole court. Her envy and jealousy burned in her heart like fire. Many were the lies she carried to her husband about Hasehime, but all to no purpose. He would listen to none of her tales, telling her sharply that she was quite mistaken. At last, the stepmother, seizing the opportunity of her husband's absence, ordered one of her old servants to take the innocent girl to the Hibari Mountains, the wildest part of the country, and there he was to kill her. She invented a dreadful story about the little princess, saying that this was the only way to prevent disgrace from falling upon the family. Katoda, her vassal, was bound to obey his mistress. He saw that it would be the wisest plan to pretend obedience in the absence of the girl's father, so he placed Hasehime in a palanquin and accompanied her to the most solitary place he could find in the wild district. The poor child knew there was no good in protesting to her unkind stepmother at being sent away in this strange manner, so she went just as she was told. But the old servant knew that the young princess was quite innocent of all the things her stepmother had invented to him as reasons for her outrageous orders, and he determined to save her life. Unless he killed her, however, he could not return to his cruel taskmistress, so he decided to stay out in the wilderness. With the help of some peasants, he soon built a little cottage, and having sent secretly for his wife to come, these 2 good old people did all in their power to take care of the now unfortunate princess. She all the time trusted in her father, knowing that as soon as he returned and found her absent, he would surely come to look for her. Prince Toyonari, after some weeks, finally came home, and was told by his wife that his daughter had done something terrible and had run away for fear of being punished. He was nearly ill with anxiety. Everyone in the house told the same story, that Hase Hime had suddenly disappeared, but none of them knew why or where. For fear of scandal, he kept the matter quiet and searched everywhere he could think of, but it was all to no purpose. One day, trying to forget his terrible worry, he called all his men together and told them to make ready for several days' hunt in the mountains. They were soon ready and mounted, waiting at the gate for their lord. He rode hard and fast to the district of the Hibari Mountains, a great company following him. He was soon far ahead of everyone, and at last found himself in a narrow, picturesque valley. Looking around and admiring the scenery, he noticed a tiny house on one of the hills quite near, and then he distinctly heard a beautifully clear voice reading aloud. Seized with curiosity as to who could be studying so diligently in such a lonely spot, he dismounted, and leaving his horse to his groom, he walked up the hillside and approached the cottage. As he drew nearer, his surprise increased, for he could now see the reader was a beautiful girl. The cottage was wide open, and she was sitting facing the view. Listening attentively, he heard her reading the Buddhist scriptures with great devotion. More and more curious, he hurried on to the tiny gate and entered the little garden. Looking up, beheld his lost daughter, Hase Hime. She was so intent on what she was saying that she neither heard nor saw what her father, until he spoke. "Hase Hime," he cried, "it is you, my daughter." Taken by surprise, she could hardly realize that it was her own dear father who was calling to her, and for a moment she was utterly bereft of the power to speak or move. "My father, oh, it's indeed you," was all that she could say, and running to him she caught hold of his thick sleeve, and burying her face, burst into a passion of tears. Her father stroked her dark hair, asking her gently to tell him all that had happened, but she only wept on, and he wondered if he were not really dreaming. And then the faithful old servant Katoda came out, and bowing himself to the ground before his master, poured out the long tale of wrongdoing, telling him all that had happened, and how it was that he found his daughter in such a wild and desolate spot with only 2 servants to look after her. The prince's astonishment and indignation knew no bounds. He gave up the hunt at once, and hurried home with his daughter. One of the company galloped ahead to inform the household of the glad news, and the stepmother, hearing what had happened, and fearful of meeting her husband now that her wickedness was exposed, fled from the house, and returned in disgrace to her father's roof, and no more was heard of her. The old servant Katoda was rewarded with the highest promotion in his master's service, and he lived happily and peacefully to the end of his days, devoted to the little princess, who never forgot that she owed her life to this faithful retainer. She was no longer troubled by an unkind stepmother, and her days passed happily and quietly with her father. As Prince Toyonari had no son, he adopted a younger son of one of the court nobles to be his heir, and to marry his daughter, and in a few years the marriage took place. As for Hase, she lived to a good old age, and all said that she was the wisest, most devout, most beautiful that had ever reigned in Princess Toyonari's ancient house. She had the joy of presenting her son, the future lord of the family, to her father just before he retired from active life. To this day, there is preserved a piece of needlework in one of the Buddhist temples of Kyoto. It is a beautiful piece of tapestry, with the figure of the Buddha embroidered in the silky threads drawn from the stem of the lotus. This is said to have been the work of the hands of the good Princess Hase. The Tale of the Shinansha, or the South-Pointing Carriage. The compass, with its needle always pointing to the north, is quite a common thing, and no one thinks that it is remarkable now, though when it was first invented, it certainly must have been quite a wonder. Now, long ago in China, there was still more wonderful invention. It was called the Shinansha. This was a kind of chariot with the figure of a man on it, who was always pointing to the south. No matter how the chariot was placed, the figure always wheeled about and pointed to the south. The curious instrument was invented by Kotei, one of the 3 Chinese emperors of the mythological age. Kotei was the son of Emperor Yu He. Before he was born, his mother had a vision which foretold that her son would be a great man. One summer evening, she went out to walk in the meadows, to seek the cool breezes which blow at the end of the day, and to gaze with pleasure at the starlit heavens above her. As she looked at the North Star, strange to relate, it shot forth vivid flashes of lightning in every which direction. Soon after this, her son Kotei came to the world. Kotei, in time, grew to manhood, and succeeded his father, the Emperor Yu He. His early reign was greatly troubled by the rebel Shi Yu. This rebel wanted to make himself king, and many were the battles which he fought to this end. Shi Yu was not just a rebel, but a wicked magician. His head was made of iron, and there was no man that could conquer him. At last, Kotei declared war against the rebel, and led his army to battle. And the 2 armies met on a plain called Takuroku. The emperor boldly attacked the enemy, but the magician brought down a dense fog upon the battlefield, and while the royal army were wandering about in their confusion, trying to find their way, Shi Yu retreated with his troops, laughing, having fooled the royal forces. No matter how strong and brave the emperor's soldiers were, the rebel with his magic could always escape in the end. So Kotei returned to his palace, and thought and pondered deeply as to how he should conquer the magician, for he was determined not to give up yet. After a long time, he invented the Shinansha, with the figure of a man always pointing south, for there were no compasses in those days. With this instrument to show him the way, he need not fear the dense fogs raised up by the magician to confound his men. And thus again Kotei declared war against Shi Yu. He placed the Shinansha in front of his army and led the way to the battlefield. The battle began in earnest. The rebel was being driven backward by the royal troops, when he again resorted to his magic, and upon his saying some strange words in a loud bellowing voice, Immediately a dense fog came down upon the battlefield. But this time no soldier minded the fog. Not a single one of them was confused. Kotei, by pointing to the Shinansha, could find his way and directed the army without a single mistake. He closely pursued the rebel army and drove them backward till they came to a big river. This river Kotei and his men found was swollen by the floods and impossible to cross. Shiyu, by using his magic art, had quickly passed over with his army and shut himself up inside a fortress on the opposite bank. When Kotei found his march checked, he was with wild disappointment, for he had very nearly overtaken the rebel when the river had stopped him. And he could do nothing, for in those days there were no boats. So the emperor ordered his tent to be pitched in the pleasantest spot that the place could afford him. One day he stepped forth from his tent, and after walking about for a short time he came to a pond. Here he sat down on the bank and was lost in his thoughts. It was autumn. The trees growing along the edge of the water were shedding their leaves, which floated to and fro on the surface of the pond. By and by, Kotei's attention was attracted to a spider on the brink of the water. The little insect was trying to get on to one of the floating leaves nearby, and at last it managed to do so, and was soon floating over the water to the other side of the pond. This little incident made the clever emperor think that he may try to make something that he could carry himself and his men over the river in the same way that the leaf had carried over the spider. He set to work, and persevered till he invented the first boat. When he found it was a success, he set all his men to make more, and in time there were enough boats for the entire army. Kotei now took his army across the river and attacked Shiyu's headquarters. He gained a complete victory, and so put an end to the war which had troubled his country for so long. The wise and good emperor did not rest till he had secured peace and prosperity throughout his whole land. He was beloved by his subjects, who now enjoyed their happiness of peace for many long years under him. He spent a great deal of time in making inventions which would benefit his people, and he succeeded in many besides the boat and the south-pointing compass Shinansha. He had reigned about 100 years, when one day, as Kotei was looking upwards, the sky suddenly began to turn red, and something came glittering like gold towards the earth. As it came nearer, Kotei saw that it was a great dragon. The dragon approached and bowed down its head before the emperor. The empress and the courtiers were so frightened that they ran away in fear, screaming. But the emperor only smiled and called to them to stop, saying, "Do not be afraid. This is a messenger from heaven. My time here is finished." He then mounted the dragon, which began to ascend toward the sky. When the empress and the courtiers saw this, they all cried out together, "Wait! We want to come too!" And they all ran and caught hold of the dragon's beard and tried to mount him. But it was impossible for so many people to ride on the dragon. Several of them hung onto the creature's beard, so that when it tried to mount, the hair was pulled out, and they fell to the ground. Meanwhile, the Empress and a few of the courtiers were safely seated on the dragon's back. The dragon flew up so high in the heavens that in a short time the inmates of the palace, who had been left behind disappointed, could see them no more. After some time, a bow and an arrow were dropped to the earth in the courtyard of the palace. They were recognized as having belonged to the Emperor Kote. The courtiers took them up carefully and preserved them as sacred relics in the palace forever.